Welcome back. Today we're reading Chapter 6. An uninvited guest. Scarlet O'Neil pondered over the confession which Cecil Strike had unknowingly made to her. She was boiling with anger at the thought of the trick he had played on the city investigators, and then his attempt to squeeze more rent out of the tenants. She knew there must be a way to expose the hoax. Yet there was no legal way she could take steps, for who would believe that an invisible listener had overheard Strike's boasting? "I have an idea that might work," Scarlet said with a smile. She raced out of the real estate office and climbed into her roadster. She drove down a side street and made herself visible again, and then headed for Charlie Dew's offices. "Charlie, do you think you could find out the names of those city investigators who inspected Strike's property?" she asked as she burst in on the surprised architect. "I think so. The mayor should know them. I'll call," he answered. He shot a questioning glance in Scarlet's direction, then picked up the telephone and gave the city hall number. The mayor readily supplied the names of the investigators. "Yes, well, thanks, Mayor. Oh, don't let them know I asked for this information, will you?" Charlie cautioned. "Okay, Charles, I hope it helps," the mayor responded in a puzzled voice. Charles wrote the names and addresses on a piece of notepaper and handed it to Scarlet, saying, "There you are, Scarlet. Now, just what have you in mind, young lady?" Scarlet smiled as she clutched the paper and hurriedly turned to leave, saying over her shoulder, "Leave that up to me, Charles, 3 of them. I'll see you later." Scarlet O'Neil was smiling mischievously as she drove toward the first address on the list of 3, which Charles had given her. It was a beautiful apartment building in the best section of the city. Scarlet entered the foyer and, after cautiously looking around to see that no one was watching, made herself invisible. "This is the apartment where one of the committee men lives," she thought. There was a responding buzz, and Scarlet opened the door. She quickly ran up the flight of steps, just as a large, haughty woman opened a door and peered about through her pince-nez. The woman, unable to see the invisible Scarlet, who was standing right in front of her, inquired, "Who's there?" "Well, it's about time you opened the door. I should have my own key," Scarlet said in a ghostly voice. She squeezed past the woman and entered the room. The committee man's wife, whose name was Matilda Updike, looked at first mildly alarmed and then baffled. She stretched her neck and looked down the hall. "What? Who in the world said that?" she asked in a quavering tone. Scarlet, who by this time was in back of her, answered, "I did, Mrs. Updike. I lived in this apartment before you rented it." Scarlet sighed. Oh, and then she added sorrowfully, "But then I died." Mrs. Updike whirled around. Her fingers shook as she perched her glasses on her nose. She nibbled at her fingernails and then sat down hard on the sofa, muttering, "Oh, this can't be. I simply must control myself." Oh, Scarlet, who was enjoying herself immensely, sat down next to her and continued her ghostly act, saying sadly, "Oh yes, I've been away for some time, but I found like there's no place like home, is there? Scarlet sighed again. Mrs. Updike jumped up and walked around the room. Scarlet followed and asked, "It is really a very nice apartment, isn't it, Mrs. Updike?" Mrs. Updike, biting her nails, began to perspire freely. Now, Matilda, you must control yourself," she said. She glanced at the tea table and then sat down next to it. "A spot of tea. Yes, that's what I need," she said in a quaking voice, and then moaned. Oh. The teapot seemed to be picking itself up and pouring tea into a cup. Scarlet, who had lifted it, said, "Here, let me pour. I'll have one too." She calmly poured herself a cup of tea and began to drink it, watching amusedly, while Mrs. Updike, with trembling fingers, spilled hers. Mrs. Updike, leaving the table with its magically moving cup and teapot, tiptoed to the telephone and hoarsely called a number, glancing furtively around her. Mrs. Updike whispered, Hello? Is this you, Joe? Scarlet finished her tea and stood beside the trembling woman. She heard Mr. Updike's voice saying, Yes, what's wrong, Matilda? I can hardly hear you. Ghosts, Mrs. Updike croaked into the receiver. What? Ghosts? Now listen, her husband began. I tell you, if you don't come home this instant, Ouch! It just pinched me. Oh, she sobbed as she broke the telephone connection. Mrs. Updike huddled in a corner of the sofa, afraid to move, while she waited for her husband to come. Scarlet relaxed in a chair and kept silent until hurried footsteps could be heard nearing the apartment door. Mrs. Updike opened the door and held a finger to her lips to caution him to be quiet. Now, Matilda, what is this silly talk about a ghost? It's just you, Mr. Updike began, but Scarlet interrupted. Joe, what do you know? She said flippantly. Huh? Did you say that, Matilda? He asked. Matilda, my eye, Scarlet answered before Matilda could reply. I said it. Sit down. What are you getting all excited about? She sat down and picked up the bowl of cookies and helped herself to one, and then passed the bowl to Mr. Updike, asking, Have a cookie? They're good. Mr. Updike was about to take one in his hand when he suddenly gulped. See, Joseph? I tell you, I'm not staying here another minute, Mrs. Updike said, pointing to the raised bowl. Her husband ran his finger under his collar and gulped again and looked quite frightened. We're moving, Mrs. Updike announced in her most emphatic manner. But Matilda, it's impossible to find a place anywhere, protested Mr. Updike, more alarmed at the thought of moving than he had been by the voice coming from space. He watched helplessly while his wife rushed to the bureau and began to pull out clothing. She worked frantically. Joseph, I say we're moving. I won't stay in this apartment another minute with that, whatever it is, she said. But Matilda, please, it's impossible to even get a room anywhere, her husband pleaded. Scarlet, who had been watching in silence, decided to lend a helping hand. She picked up a garment and handed it to Mrs. Updike, saying politely, Here, let me help you pack. Please, Mrs. Updike shrilled. I can manage. She snatched the garment and stuffed it in the opened traveling case. Scarlet suppressed a giggle and she waited until the Updikes had picked up their bags and started out the door before she held up a piece of underwear and shouted, "Hey, you forgot something." "Oh!" gasped the outraged Matilda as she stalked down the stairway. "Ah, it worked," Scarlet said triumphantly. "Now, for the other two committee men." What was Invisible Scarlet's plan? How was this helping Charlie? Join me again next time when we read Chapter 7. No Place to Sleep.